My husband texted, "Come home. We have wonderful news." I walked in carrying our 1-year-old daughter, expecting a celebration. Instead, I found both our families waiting in the living room like a firing squad. He dropped a DNA test onto the glass coffee table in front of everyone and shouted, "She is not my child." My mother-in-law yelled at me to get out and take my bastard with me. I just smiled, reached into my diaper bag, and prepared to ruin his life. But before I could speak, the front door rattled with a heavy, aggressive knock. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who tried to destroy your name. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, living in Sacramento, California, and until August of 2026. I thought I knew the people sitting in my living room. I work as a financial consultant, or so my family believes. I walked through the front doors of our home, shifting little Zuri onto my hip. The house was dead quiet. No balloons, no champagne. Just my husband Marcus, standing by the fireplace with his chest puffed out. Sitting on the leather sofas were his mother Beatrice, my own mother Darlene, my sister Chloe, and her husband Trent. Trent, a real estate developer who loved to play the white savior for our family, was swirling a glass of bourbon, looking at me with that familiar, arrogant smirk. Chloe, the undisputed golden child of my mother's world, had her legs crossed watching me like I was a reality television villain. Darlene would not even look me in the eye. "What is going on?" I asked, setting Zuri's diaper bag on the floor. Marcus did not answer. He marched forward and slammed a piece of paper down on the table. The loud smack made Zuri jump. "I took a paternity test," Marcus announced, his voice booming so everyone could hear his performance. "The results came back this morning. She is not my child." The room erupted right on cue. Beatrice leaped up from the sofa, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "I knew it," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "I always knew you were trash, Nia. You trapped my son with another man's baby. Pack your bags and get your bastard child out of my son's house right now." My own mother. Darlene stood up, shaking her head in theatrical disappointment. "How could you bring this shame on our family?" Darlene asked, clutching her chest. "You could not just be a good, respectable wife like your sister. You always had to be the problem child." Chloe patted Darlene's back, whispering about how embarrassing this was going to be for them at church on Sunday. Trent chimed in, taking a slow sip of his expensive bourbon. "Well, statistics do show certain behavioral patterns in your demographic, Nia. I just hoped Marcus had chosen one of the good ones." His casual racism hung in the air, validated by the silence of the very black women he was insulting. They expected me to break down. They expected me to drop to my knees, cry, beg for forgiveness, and run out the door with nothing. Marcus stood there looking triumphant, ready to file for a fast divorce where he kept all the assets while ruining my reputation. Instead of crying, a sound escaped my throat. A cold, sharp laugh. It started low and grew louder, until the entire room fell dead silent. Beatrice looked at me like I had lost my mind. "You think this is funny?" Marcus yelled, his face turning an angry shade of red. "You are a deceitful adulterer, Nia. It is right here on paper." It was funny because I knew the absolute truth. Marcus was completely medically sterile. His sperm count was 0. Zuri was the beautiful result of an anonymous sperm donor and 3 grueling rounds of in vitro fertilization. When we received his diagnosis 2 years ago, Marcus was devastated, not because we could not conceive naturally, but because his fragile ego could not handle the stigma. He begged me to keep it a secret. He even brought a non-disclosure agreement to our kitchen table, legally binding me to never reveal his infertility to anyone, especially his highly judgmental mother. I had signed that document out of love and pity. I protected his masculinity. And now this coward was using the very DNA test he knew would be negative to frame me for infidelity. He wanted a clean exit, keeping his pride and his money intact, throwing me and our daughter to the wolves. I stopped laughing and looked Marcus dead in the eye. The smug satisfaction on his face began to waver slightly. I shifted Zuri to my other hip and slowly reached my free hand into the diaper bag. I was not reaching for a tissue to wipe away tears. I was reaching for my phone to pull up the certified medical records from the fertility clinic. I was going to read his sterile diagnosis out loud to his elitist mother, my enabling mother, my jealous sister, and his racist brother-in-law. The non-disclosure agreement was entirely void the moment he decided to publicly defame my character in front of an audience. I took a deep breath, feeling the power shift entirely into my hands. This was the exact perfect moment I had been eagerly waiting for after years of silent suffering. I opened my mouth to completely destroy his carefully constructed narrative and watch his world crumble into tiny little pieces. But before a single word could leave my lips, the heavy front door rattled violently. Someone was pounding on the thick oak wood with enough force to shake the walls, demanding immediate entry and interrupting my sweet revenge. Marcus puffed out his chest and marched toward the entryway, clearly annoyed that his grand moment of humiliating me was being disrupted. He reached for the brass handle ready to snap at whoever was standing on our porch, but he never got the chance. The heavy oak door swung open with terrifying force, smashing against the wall and shattering the decorative mirror hanging behind it. 5 men in dark green tactical windbreakers stormed into the living room. Their boots pounded against the hardwood floors, instantly destroying the pristine image Beatrice demanded we maintain. They moved with absolute precision, fanning out across the room and completely surrounding us. The letters FBI were printed in bold yellow across their backs. Marcus froze, his hands raised instinctively in the air. The smug satisfaction that had plastered his face just seconds ago vanished, replaced by an ashen, trembling terror. A senior agent, a tall man with a stern face and a clipped badge on his belt, stepped directly into Marcus's personal space. "Marcus Davenport," the agent asked, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the living room. Marcus could barely nod. He looked like a deflated balloon. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest," the senior agent announced, pulling a thick folded document from his jacket. "You are being charged with massive wire fraud and embezzling exactly $8 million from your clients. Put your hands behind your back right now." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. $8 million. My husband, the man who just tried to throw me out on the streets with a fake infidelity claim to protect his assets, had been stealing from innocent people to fund the lifestyle his mother so desperately craved. 2 agents grabbed Marcus by his tailored suit jacket, spinning him around forcefully. They shoved his chest against the expensive textured wallpaper of the living room. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the house. Panic erupted, but not for me. I stood perfectly still, holding Zuri close to my chest, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute clarity. The reactions of my so-called family told me everything I ever needed to know about my place in their world. My own biological mother, Darlene, shrieked. But instead of running to check on me, her daughter, whose house had just been raided by federal agents, she lunged in the opposite direction. She threw her arms around Chloe, my 30-year-old adult sister, shielding the golden child's eyes from the sight of the arrest, as if Chloe were a fragile toddler. "Oh, my sweet girl, do not look," Darlene cried out, physically turning Chloe away from the center of the room. "This is too much stress for you. Let mommy protect you." Darlene did not spare a single glance my way. She did not care that I was standing just feet away from armed federal agents while holding my 1-year-old baby. She only cared about preserving Chloe's delicate sensibilities, just like she had done my entire life. Every time we faced hardship growing up, Darlene made sure Chloe had the softest landing while I was left to absorb the impact of the concrete. Meanwhile, Trent, Chloe's husband, stepped back to ensure his Italian leather loafers were not scuffed in the commotion. He adjusted his blazer and scoffed, shaking his head with a look of supreme upper-class disgust. He watched the agents pat down Marcus and leaned over to whisper to Darlene, though his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, this is exactly what happens when you let street mentality into corporate America," Trent muttered with a heavy sigh. "You can take the man out of the hood, but you cannot teach him how to manage real money." I tightened my grip on Zuri. Trent was standing in the middle of a federal raid, watching a man get arrested for a sophisticated white-collar embezzlement scheme, and his immediate reaction was to drop a racist microaggression. He completely ignored the fact that Marcus grew up in a wealthy suburb and attended private schools his whole life. To Trent, a white man wrapped in unchecked privilege, any failure by a black man was an inherent flaw in our culture, not a criminal choice. He stood there acting completely superior, totally unaware that the financial empire he claimed to rule was built on sand. Marcus began to cry. Real, ugly, desperate tears streamed down his face as the agents dragged him away from the wall. "Mom, do something," he wailed, looking frantically at Beatrice. "Call the lawyers, do not let them take me." Beatrice finally snapped out of her frozen shock. The elitist matriarch who had just called me trash minutes ago completely lost her mind. She dropped to her knees right in the middle of the living room, her designer dress pooling around her on the hardwood floor. She screamed hysterically, begging the agents to stop claiming her son was a good, honest man who was being framed. When the agents ignored her and continued marching Marcus toward the front door, she pivoted her manic desperation toward me. Beatrice scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees. She lunged forward and grabbed my ankle with a bruising, violent grip. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin. "Nia, you have to help him," Beatrice shrieked, looking up at me with wild, tear-filled eyes. "You need to call the bank right now. Drain your measly little retirement savings. Sell whatever cheap jewelry you have. You have to pay for his bail immediately." She was demanding that I empty my accounts to save the exact same man who had just presented a fake DNA test to destroy my life. She expected the black woman she had always treated like a stepping stool to suddenly become the bridge her son could walk across to freedom. I looked down at the woman gripping my ankle. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not show an ounce of the weakness they constantly projected onto me. I slowly stepped back, forcing her hands to slide off my leg. I adjusted Zuri in my arms and looked down at Beatrice with an icy, unbothered stare. "My bastard child and I do not have a dime for a federal felon," I said. The heavy silence shattered. David lunged across the spilled bourbon, grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his custom Italian suit. "You told me the commercial real estate risk was hedged," David screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You said the guarantor account was ironclad. How does a blind trust just vanish into thin air, Marcus? How do $8.5 million simply evaporate?" Marcus shoved his older brother backward, his own face contorted with equal parts rage and sheer terror. "Get your hands off me," Marcus roared. "I do not control the banking algorithms, David. You are the one who insisted on leveraging our operating accounts to buy those deadweight strip malls in Midtown. If you had not drained our liquid cash to keep your vanity projects afloat, Chase Bank would not have initiated a margin call." Beatrice gasped, clutching the pearls at her neck. "A margin call," she repeated the words, practically choking her. "Marcus, what are you talking about? We are a prestigious family. Banks do not freeze our accounts. Call the branch manager immediately and fix this." Chloe stood frozen near the fireplace, her wineglass completely forgotten. "David," she said, her voice shrill and trembling. "David, look at me. Does this mean my black card is frozen? I have a charity gala to underwrite tomorrow morning. You promised me those funds were cleared." "Shut up about your charity gala, Chloe." David snapped, a rare crack in his normally subservient demeanor toward his white wife. "We cannot even make payroll on Monday morning. If we do not wire $300,000 by 9 a.m., the federal regulators will be knocking on our doors by noon. We will be facing criminal negligence." Marcus began pacing the length of the formal living room, running his hands roughly over his perfectly groomed hair. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the picture of a man watching his entire fabricated reality burn to ashes. He muttered to himself, running frantic calculations, trying to find a magical loophole in a mathematically impossible situation. Then his frantic pacing stopped. He turned slowly, his desperate bloodshot eyes locking onto me. I was still standing exactly where I had been, perfectly calm, my posture relaxed. "Maya," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding tone that he usually reserved for his subordinates. "How much is in your personal savings?" I tilted my head, feigning mild confusion. "Excuse me. Do not play stupid with me right now," Marcus barked, taking a step toward me. "You have been working that mid-level corporate job for years. You barely spend anything because I cover the house and the cars. You must have a few $100,000 stacked away in your little savings account. I need you to wire every single cent of it to the firm's holding account right now. It will not cover the margin call, but it will keep payroll afloat until I can secure a bridge loan." I looked at him, studying the absolute audacity radiating from his pores. Less than 20 minutes ago, he had locked my credit card to teach me a lesson about financial discipline. He had stood in this very room and declared that I brought nothing to the table, that I was a burden he graciously kept a roof over. Now, facing the barrel of federal negligence, he was demanding the very money he loved to belittle. No, I said. Just one simple quiet word. The entire room went dead silent again. Beatrice stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. Marcus blinked, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. "What did you just say to me?" Marcus asked, taking another aggressive step into my personal space. I said, "No, Marcus, I am not transferring a single penny to your firm." "You listen to me, you ungrateful woman!" Beatrice hissed, marching forward to stand beside her son. "This family took you in when you were nothing. My son elevated your status. You owe this family your absolute loyalty. If you have the means to help your husband save his legacy, you will do it immediately." Marcus did not wait for my response. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. "You are my wife, Maya. That means what is yours is mine. I do not care if I have to call your bank myself and authorize the transfer as the head of this household. You are going to hand over those funds, or I will legally compel you to do so. You cannot hide your money from your own husband." I did not flinch. I did not step back. Instead, I calmly unclasped the gold hardware of my designer handbag. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legally bound document housed in a heavy blue cover. Without breaking eye contact with Marcus, I dropped the document directly onto the mahogany coffee table, right into the puddle of spilled bourbon. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, glancing down at the damp pages. "That," I said, keeping my voice smooth and lethal, "is our prenuptial agreement." Marcus froze. Beatrice's mouth fell open slightly. "Do you remember the morning of our rehearsal dinner, Marcus?" I asked, stepping around him to look directly at the document. "You were so absolutely terrified that the poor dark-skinned girl from the South Side was going to steal your precious generational wealth. You and your mother hired the most aggressive, cutthroat corporate lawyers in Georgia to draft that contract. You ambushed me with it hours before the wedding. You told me that if I did not sign it, there would be no marriage." I watched the realization begin to dawn in his eyes, a slow, horrifying comprehension. I read page 14 very carefully before I signed it. I continued. "It states in extremely explicit legal terms that all assets, bank accounts, business entities, and revenue streams acquired by either party, both prior to and during the marriage, remain the sole untouchable property of the original owner. In the event of a financial crisis, neither party can be legally compelled to liquidate their independent assets to satisfy the debts of the other." Marcus stared at the blue binder as if it were a venomous snake. "You meant to build a fortress to lock me out of your wealth," I said, leaning in close enough so only he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "But you were too arrogant to realize that you were actually building a steel vault to lock yourself out of mine. You cannot touch my money, Marcus. You legally barred yourself from it 5 years ago." "You are insane," Marcus breathed out, his voice shaking. "You think your little corporate savings account matters. It would not even make a dent in the 8.5 million we owe. You are completely delusional if you think you have any real power here." I just smiled. I let him cling to that fragile, crumbling belief for one more second. Suddenly, David's phone chimed. It was not a phone call this time. It was a high-priority email alert, the specific piercing tone they used for executive board communications. David snatched his phone from the table, his eyes scanning the screen. As he read, the last remaining trace of color vanished from his face. His hands began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the device. He looked up, his eyes wide, completely unhinged. "Marcus," David choked out, his voice a hollow, terrified rasp. "Marcus, it is Apex Logistics." Marcus whipped his head around. "Apex? What about them? They provide 40% of our annual revenue. Did they approve the invoice advance?" "No. No," David whispered, staring at the screen in pure horror. "They just terminated our vendor contract, indefinitely, effective immediately. They are citing a breach of financial trust." Marcus grabbed his own hair, letting out a sound that was half scream, half sob. "Terminated. They cannot terminate. We manage their entire southeastern investment portfolio." Who the hell authorized a unilateral termination without a board meeting? Who signed that email? David slowly lifted his eyes from the screen. He looked past Marcus. He looked directly at me. The absolute dread in his expression was intoxicating. The CEO of Apex Logistics signed it. David said, his voice trembling so hard the words barely made it into the silent room. Marcus stared at his brother. And who is the CEO of Apex Logistics, David? David swallowed hard. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She is. Maya is. The living room erupted into chaos. The second those words left my mouth, Beatrice scrambled up from the hardwood floor, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You worthless, ungrateful woman," she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "My son gave you a life. He gave you a roof over your head, and this is how you repay him." Darlene, my own mother, released her protective grip on Chloe just long enough to join the firing squad. "Beatrice is right," Darlene snapped, stepping forward. "You have always been selfish, Nia. Always thinking about yourself. Your husband is in trouble, and instead of stepping up, you are playing games. This is exactly why I always worried about you. You do not know how to be a wife. You never learned how to support a family. Look at your sister. Look at how Chloe respects her husband." She looked at me with fake pity, whispering about how I was tearing the family apart. That was the dynamic they loved. I was the scapegoat, the punching bag, the dark cloud they could blame for every storm, while Chloe remained the flawless, untouchable golden child. He loved nothing more than playing the ultimate white savior for our family. He looked at me with a condescending tilt of his head, exuding the kind of arrogant privilege that only came from a lifetime of never facing real consequences. "Nia, let us be reasonable here," Trent said, using that slow, pacifying tone people use when talking to a hostile teenager. "This is a family crisis. We need unity, not your typical defensive attitude. Strong black women are supposed to stand by their men when the system comes for them. Is that not what you all say? Ride or die. You should be down at that precinct fighting for Marcus, not standing here acting bitter over some trivial marital dispute." I stared at him, my jaw tight. He was actually using the strong black woman trope to guilt-trip me into funding a man who had just tried to discard me. He was weaponizing my race and my culture to serve his own narrative. I tightened my grip on Zuri, feeling her soft breaths against my collarbone. I refused to let his blatant manipulation break my composure. When I did not immediately bow my head in submission, Trent scoffed and turned his back to me, addressing Beatrice with a grand, comforting smile. "Do not worry about a thing," Beatrice, Trent announced, puffing out his chest. "You do not need to rely on someone who clearly lacks basic family loyalty. I will handle this. I am going to post the $500,000 bail right now. At least Chloe married a real man who can provide." He pulled out a black American Express card. He held it up so the overhead lights caught the matte finish, making sure Darlene and Chloe saw exactly how much financial power he wielded. Chloe let out a breathy sigh of relief. "See, Mom?" Chloe whispered loudly to Darlene. "This is what a real man looks like. A provider. Someone who actually steps up when things get hard." Darlene nodded vigorously, wiping a dramatic tear from her eye. "Thank God for you, Trent. You are the only real man left in this family." Trent soaked up their praise like a sponge. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, tapped the screen a few times, and put the device on speakerphone for maximum theatrical effect. He wanted everyone in the room to hear him save the day. He dialed the number for an elite bail bondsman he kept on retainer for his real estate development firm. The line rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "Platinum Bail Services, how can I help you?" "Yes, this is Trent Lawson," he said, pacing across the floor. "I need to arrange an immediate bond transfer for my brother-in-law, Marcus Davenport. The amount is $500,000. Put it on the Amex ending in 4022. "Certainly, Mr. Lawson. Processing that right now. Please hold for just a moment." Beatrice clasped her hands together in prayer, looking at Trent like he was a visiting angel sent directly from heaven. They all waited for the satisfying sound of a transaction approval. Instead, the phone emitted a harsh electronic beep. "Sir," the bondsman said, her voice dropping its cheerful tone, "I am getting a decline error on this card." Trent stopped pacing. His arrogant smile faltered. That is impossible. It is a black card with no preset limit. Run it again. Your system is flagging the large amount as fraud. I am running it again now, sir. Another sharp beep echoed through the silent living room. I am sorry, Mr. Lawson. It is a hard decline. The error code indicates the account has been frozen. You will need to contact your issuing bank. Trent flushed a deep crimson. Chloe stepped back in confusion. Beatrice let out a gasp. This is ridiculous, Trent snapped. Give me a minute. I will call my banker. This is just a hold. He dialed his private wealth manager, keeping the phone on speaker to prove he was in control. The phone rang, and a man answered. Lawson, the banker, said with panic. I was just calling you. Listen, Trent barked. My Amex declined for $500,000. Fix it now. Remove the security hold. Sir, I cannot do that, the banker replied, shaking. Your accounts have not been flagged for security. They are frozen by your primary bondholder. A private equity firm initiated a total asset freeze pending an investigation. We cannot move a cent. Trent went pale. What do you mean, he demanded, cracking. Who authorized that? My phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced at it. It was a message from my officer confirming our takeover. I locked my screen and slid the phone away. I stepped forward and smiled coldly. Looks like your money just vanished. Sunday afternoon brought suffocating heat, but the real fire burned at Greater Hope Fellowship. The church cookout was the ultimate social event for the local African American community. It was a place for fellowship gospel music and, unfortunately, weaponized gossip. Under the white canopy tent, Beatrice and my mother Darlene set up a staging ground for my public execution. They sat in folding chairs like royalty holding court with the most influential church elders. Beatrice put on the performance of a lifetime. She dabbed her dry eyes, passing around heavily photocopied sheets of paper. It was the entirely fake DNA test Marcus had thrown at me just days prior. Darlene sat beside her, shaking her head in theatrical mourning, playing the heartbroken mother who simply could not understand where she went wrong with her eldest daughter. Just look at this, Beatrice wailed to a group of gasping church mothers. My Marcus gave that woman the world. I gave her a mansion, a beautiful life, and she repaid him by bringing another man's baby into his home. When he confronted her with the truth, she called the authorities and had him framed for fraud out of pure spite. Darlene clutched her chest, leaning into the false narrative. I tried to raise Nia right. She cried loudly, making sure the people at the neighboring tables heard every single word. I tried to teach her the value of a good, strong black family, but she was always so jealous of her sister Chloe. Nia let the devil into her heart. She destroyed her marriage and ruined a good man just because she could not keep her vows. The whispers spread through the cookout faster than a wildfire. Aunts, deacons, and choir members passed the fake documents around, shaking their heads in collective disgust. In our tight-knit community, the church was the ultimate courtroom, and Beatrice positioned herself as the tragic victim of an adulterous daughter-in-law. They were actively rallying the entire congregation to cast me out, completely unaware that I was already pulling into the parking lot. My armored SUV rolled onto the church grounds, the heavy tires crunching over the gravel. The vehicle alone demanded attention, but my exit made time stand still. I stepped out of the spacious back seat of the vehicle, wearing a flawless, beautifully tailored ivory white designer suit. I paired it with gold stiletto heels and oversized sunglasses that shielded my eyes from the glaring sun. I did not look like a broken, evicted single mother. I looked like the owner of the bank that held all of their mortgages. As my heels clicked against the pavement, the vibrant sounds of the cookout died a sudden dramatic death. The upbeat gospel music playing from the large speakers seemed to fade into the background. The sizzle of the grills and the joyful laughter of children playing tag abruptly ceased. Hundreds of eyes turned in my direction. Forkfuls of potato salad stopped mid-air. Conversations evaporated into a thick, suffocating silence. I walked straight toward the main event area, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of calm authority. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, people physically stepping back to avoid catching whatever scandalous disease Beatrice had convinced them I carried. At the front of the lawn stood Pastor Miller. He was a tall, imposing man who had been a close personal ally of Beatrice for over 20 years. He saw the crowd parting. He saw me approaching. And he saw a prime opportunity to cement his loyalty to one of his biggest tithing families. He signaled for the sound technician to cut the music completely. Pastor Miller gripped his wireless microphone and stepped up onto the small wooden stage that had been erected for the church announcements. He cleared his throat, ensuring the sharp feedback echoed loudly across the silent lawn. Church family Pastor Miller boomed, his voice dripping with that specific brand of sanctimonious pity designed to humiliate. We are a place of healing. We are a place of forgiveness. And the Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing the lost sheep right to our very doorstep. He pointed directly at me. I stopped walking, standing perfectly still in the middle of the grass, staring up at him through my dark lenses. Sister Nia, Pastor Miller continued, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the church building. We have heard the heavy burdens placed upon the Davenport family this week. We have seen the pain of a mother broken by deceit. We know that the enemy uses infidelity and spite to tear down the sanctity of holy matrimony. But God offers grace even to the most wicked of sinners. Beatrice smirked from her folding chair, her eyes shining with malicious triumph. Darlene looked down, playing the devastated mother to absolute perfection. Come forward, Sister Nia, the pastor commanded, gesturing heavily to the grassy area directly in front of his stage. Come to the altar. Let us lay hands on you. Let your community pray the deceit out of your soul. Confess your terrible sins against your husband today, and perhaps the Lord will grant you the mercy that you so desperately need. The entire congregation held its collective breath, waiting for me to crumble under the crushing weight of public humiliation. They fully expected me to hang my head in shame, to turn around and run back to my car, or to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness for a crime I never committed. I took off my sunglasses, folded them slowly, and slipped them into my pocket. I did not shed a single tear. I did not turn and run. I walked straight up to the wooden stage, my gold heels clicking against the wooden steps. I boldly stepped right into Pastor Miller's personal space. Before he could utter another hypocritical word of prayer, I reached out and ripped the microphone directly out of his hand. Pastor Miller stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock as the heavy microphone left his grip. The sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the humid afternoon air, causing several church elders in the front row to wince and cover their ears. I stood dead center on the wooden stage, looking out over the sea of judgmental faces. The same people who had just been whispering about my supposed infidelity were now staring at me in stunned silence. I adjusted my grip on the microphone and let my gaze sweep across the lawn until it locked directly onto Beatrice. She sat frozen in her folding chair, the fake DNA test still clutched in her hand. Church family. I began, my voice steady and echoing clearly through the massive speakers. Pastor Miller is absolutely right about one thing. The truth will always set you free. And today we are going to experience a whole lot of freedom on this lawn. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored ivory blazer and pulled out a thick folded stack of official hospital documents. They were not blurry photocopies passed around like cheap gossip. These were certified, notarized medical records printed on heavy bonded paper bearing the official seal of the premier fertility clinic in California. I held the stack high in the air so the bright afternoon sun illuminated the watermark for everyone to see. Beatrice has been passing around a piece of paper claiming I brought another man's child into her son's home. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. She claims Marcus took a DNA test, proving he is not the father of my beautiful daughter Zuri. Well, the truth is, Marcus did not need a DNA test to know that. He has known since the day Zuri was conceived, because he was sitting right next to me holding my hand when the doctor performed the artificial insemination. A collective gasp ripped through the congregation. Fans stopped moving. Plates of barbecue were abandoned on the tables. Beatrice dropped the fake papers onto the grass, her jaw trembling as the color completely drained from her face. I unfolded the first document and held it close to the microphone. For the past 2 years, I have honored a strict non-disclosure agreement to protect the fragile ego of Marcus Davenport. He begged me to keep his medical reality a secret because he was terrified of what his prideful mother and this very community would think of his manhood. But since he decided to commit public defamation to hide his criminal embezzlement charges, that legal agreement is officially null and void. I looked down at the paper and read the clinical diagnosis loud enough to reach the parking lot. Patient name Marcus Davenport. Diagnosis absolute non-obstructive azoospermia. Total sperm count 0. The medical conclusion is permanent and irreversible sterility. Marcus Davenport has never been able to father a child. The church lawn erupted. Women in their Sunday hats began murmuring frantically to one another. The deacons, who had just been shaking their heads in disgust at me, were now staring at Beatrice with outright shock and condemnation. I did not stop there. I flipped to the second page, holding it up and pointing to the bottom right corner. This is the official consent form for the use of an anonymous sperm donor. I announced, my voice cutting through the rising noise of the crowd. And right here on the bottom line is the signature of Marcus Davenport, legally consenting to the procedure and acknowledging his status as the father of the resulting child. He signed it in blue ink in the presence of a notary. There was no infidelity, there was no deceit. The only lie told here today was the one Beatrice spun to cover up the fact that her son is a sterile, thieving fraud who is currently sitting in a federal holding cell. Beatrice looked like she was going to faint. The elite church mothers who had been comforting her just moments ago physically leaned away from her, treating her like a pariah. Her entire narrative had crumbled into dust in less than 3 minutes. She had tried to humiliate me, but instead she had exposed her own son's greatest shame to the entire community. Suddenly, heavy footsteps hammered against the wooden stairs of the stage. My mother, Darlene, rushed up the steps, her face twisted in panic and anger. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearm with a bruising grip. She tried to pry the microphone out of my hand, but I held it firmly, refusing to yield an inch. "Nia, stop this right now," Darlene hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are embarrassing the entire family. Look at what you are doing to Beatrice. You are destroying your husband's reputation over a petty squabble. Put that microphone down and apologize before you ruin everything for your sister." I stared at the woman who had given birth to me. Even now, standing in front of certified proof that I was the victim of a vicious smear campaign, she was entirely focused on protecting Chloe's social standing and defending the people who had tried to destroy me. I yanked my arm out of her grip with such force that she stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the wooden floorboards. "I am not ruining anything," I said directly into the microphone, ensuring everyone heard my response to my own mother. "I am simply cleaning up the mess you all created. You wanted a public spectacle, Darlene. Now you have to live with it." Darlene opened her mouth to scream another command at me, but she was interrupted by a deafening crash. The heavy double doors of the church fellowship hall burst open with explosive force, slamming violently against the exterior brick walls. The loud bang startled the entire congregation, silencing the murmurs instantly. A young woman stormed out onto the lawn. She was heavily pregnant, her large belly straining against the fabric of her tight maternity dress. Her hair was a tangled mess, and dark streaks of ruined mascara ran down her flushed, tear-stained cheeks. She marched through the crowd with manic, unhinged energy, shoving past the folding chairs and ignoring the shocked stares of the church elders. She did not look at the stage. She did not look at me. She marched straight toward the front row and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Beatrice. "Where is Marcus?" the pregnant woman screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical desperation. "His phone is disconnected and his fancy condo is locked. He promised he was divorcing his wife today to marry me. He looked me in the eye and said this baby in my belly is his true heir. Where is he?" The entire church lawn descended into absolute pandemonium. The pregnant woman stood trembling in her tight maternity dress, clutching her oversized designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. She pointed her manicured finger directly at Beatrice, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. "Where is he?" the woman demanded again, her shrill voice cutting through the thick summer heat. "He set me up in a luxury condo downtown. He told me to wait for him today. He said he was coming to this church to finally expose his awful wife and claim his rightful family. He promised he was going to marry me before our son was born. He said this baby is his true heir." The church elders who had been passing around the fake DNA test just moments ago were now frozen in shock. The choir members covered their mouths. Darlene stood on the wooden stage next to me, her jaw hanging open, completely incapable of processing the spectacular destruction of her perfect family narrative. But Beatrice reacted in a way that defied all logic and sanity. Her brain, desperate to salvage any shred of victory and humiliate me, completely snapped. Instead of recognizing the catastrophic embarrassment of her son having a secret pregnant mistress, Beatrice let out a joyous, hysterical cry. She shoved her way past the frozen deacons trampling over discarded plates of food and rushed directly toward the hysterical woman. Beatrice threw her arms open wide and embraced the stranger, pressing her hands against the woman's swollen belly. "Praise the Lord," Beatrice shouted, looking up at the sky with manic fervor. "God always reveals the truth. This is the real Davenport bloodline. My Marcus is a virile, strong man. He is a provider. He knew his wicked wife was a barren, deceitful woman, so he went out and secured a true heir for our family. Do not worry, my sweet girl. We will take care of you. You are part of our family now." Beatrice turned her wild, triumphant eyes toward me standing on the stage. "You hear that, Nia? My son is a father, a real father. He replaced you. He found a real woman to give him what you never could. Pack your bags and get out of our lives." I stood on the wooden stage staring down at the pathetic display unfolding on the grass. Beatrice was clinging to a crying stranger, desperately trying to use an unborn child to salvage her son's destroyed masculinity. Darlene was nodding along, ready to accept this new narrative just to keep me in the position of the disgraced scapegoat. I brought the heavy microphone back up to my mouth. I did not yell. I did not cry. I let out a deep, resonant laugh that boomed through the massive concert speakers and echoed across the entire church parking lot. The sound was so cold and commanding that it instantly silenced Beatrice's hysterical praising. I looked directly at the pregnant woman who was now staring at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. "I am so sorry to break this to you," I said, my voice smooth and dripping with absolute certainty. "But unless you are currently carrying the second coming of Christ, that baby in your belly is definitely not his." The woman blinked, her hands instinctively wrapping around her stomach. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "He is the father. He told me he was the father." I held up the certified medical records from the fertility clinic, tapping the embossed seal with my fingernail. "I just read his official medical charts to this entire congregation 5 minutes ago. Marcus Davenport has 0 sperm. He is 100% biologically sterile. He has been completely impotent for years. Whoever got you pregnant, it certainly was not my husband." The pregnant woman froze completely. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like she might pass out right there on the grass. She stared at the medical documents in my hand, then looked down at Beatrice, who was still kneeling next to her with a horrified, vacant expression. The realization hit the woman like a freight train. She had been played. Marcus had used her, promising her a life of luxury and marriage, all while hiding his criminal embezzlement and his profound medical reality. He had set her up in a leased condo using stolen funds that were currently being seized by federal agents. She realized in a matter of seconds that Marcus was not a wealthy businessman preparing to start a new family. He was a broke, sterile fraud facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary, and he had left her holding the bag. "I want my money!" the woman suddenly shrieked, shoving Beatrice away with such force that the older woman tumbled backward into the dirt. "He owes me money. He promised me a trust fund." As the congregation erupted into a frenzy of shouting and pointing, I noticed movement at the very edge of the church lawn. Chloe and Trent had seen enough. The golden couple realized that the Davenport empire was completely obliterated, and their association with Marcus was about to become a massive liability. Trent, the arrogant white savior who had mocked me and paraded his credit card just hours ago, was practically jogging toward the rear exit of the church grounds. Chloe was right behind him, her head ducked down, trying to sneak away like a coward to avoid the community backlash. They thought they could simply walk away and leave me to deal with the ashes. They thought their perfect bubble was immune to the consequences of their actions. I gripped the microphone tightly and turned up the volume on my voice. "Chloe. Trent. I called out my words booming across the lawn and making them freeze in their tracks. Where do you think you are going? Trent turned around, his face pale. Do not take another step, I commanded. Stay there. The suffocating reality of total financial ruin should have been enough to cancel any social event. But for Beatrice Davis, maintaining the illusion of generational wealth was far more important than actual survival. Despite Marcus and David being unceremoniously escorted out of their own firm just hours prior, Beatrice stubbornly pushed forward with her backup plan. She had relocated her 40th wedding anniversary gala to the Oakmont Country Club, the most exclusive, invite-only establishment in Atlanta's high society. She was operating on sheer delusional denial, absolutely convinced that Marcus would somehow snap his fingers, secure a magical bridge loan, and fix the entire catastrophe before the appetizers were served. I arrived at the Oakmont Country Club at 8 o'clock sharp. I wore a floor-length emerald green silk gown that moved like liquid glass, paired with the diamond tennis bracelet I had bought myself after closing my first international shipping route. I handed my keys to the valet and walked gracefully up the sweeping marble steps of the main entrance. The heavy mahogany doors were held open by staff in crisp white uniforms, but the welcoming atmosphere violently vanished the moment I approached the grand ballroom. Two large security guards immediately stepped into the center of the double doors, physically blocking my path. A hostess wearing a tight black dress and holding a silver clipboard stepped out from behind them. She looked me up and down with a practiced elitist sneer. You must be Maya. The hostess said, her tone dripping with the kind of polished condescension Beatrice specialized in. I am sorry, but your name has been explicitly removed from the guest list. I looked at the woman, my expression perfectly neutral. Is that so? Beatrice Davis left very strict instructions regarding your arrival. The hostess continued, lifting her chin with misplaced arrogance. She told our staff, and I quote, do not let the ungrateful wife inside. She emphasized that this is a private event for prestigious guests only, and you are no longer affiliated with the Davis family. I am going to have to ask you to turn around and leave the premises before I have security escort you off the property. For years, Beatrice had used exclusive country club memberships as a weapon to remind me of my place. She loved throwing lavish brunches and charity auctions at these restricted venues, making sure to loudly announce that I was only allowed through the front doors because I was riding on her son's coattails. She wielded access like a club, constantly reinforcing the narrative that a dark-skinned girl from a working-class neighborhood could never belong in these gilded halls on her own merit. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the hostess or try to push past the massive security guards. I simply reached into my emerald clutch, pulled out my phone, and sent a single predetermined text message. I think I will stay right here, I replied smoothly, slipping the phone back into my bag. The hostess rolled her eyes, motioning for the guards to step forward. I am not going to ask you again. Before the guards could even reach for my arms, a frantic, breathless shout echoed across the marble lobby. Stop right there. Do not touch her. The general manager of the Oakmont Country Club. A perpetually stressed man named Sterling sprinted across the foyer. His face was completely flushed, and he was sweating through his expensive tailored suit. He shoved past the two security guards with surprising force, nearly knocking the smug hostess off her high heels. Sterling stopped inches in front of me, gasping for air as he frantically smoothed his tie. He bowed his head so low it was almost comical. Mrs. Davis, Sterling panted, his voice trembling with sheer panic. I am so incredibly sorry. I was not notified you had arrived. Please accept my deepest, most profound apologies for this unacceptable delay. The hostess stared at her boss as if he had lost his mind. Mr. Sterling, she stammered. Beatrice Davis expressly forbade this woman from entering the ballroom. She said we would lose their account if we let her in. Sterling whipped his head around, glaring at the hostess with absolute fury. Beatrice Davis does not dictate who walks through those doors. You absolute fool, do you have any idea who you are talking to right now? He gestured frantically toward me. This is the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings. Her corporate trust finalized the acquisition of our entire parent real estate group last Thursday. She does not just have a membership here. She literally owns the building you are standing in. The color instantly drained from the hostess's face. The clipboard slipped from her hands, clattering loudly against the marble floor. The two security guards immediately stepped back, suddenly looking very interested in the ceiling patterns. Sterling turned back to me, clasping his hands together in a desperate plea for forgiveness. "Please write this way, Mrs. Davis. I have prepared the private VIP balcony for you exactly as your executive assistant requested. You will have a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. Lead the way." "Sterling," I said, not sparing a single glance for the terrified hostess as I swept past her. Sterling escorted me up a sweeping private staircase wrapped in velvet ropes. He opened a set of heavy, soundproof doors, revealing an opulent, darkened balcony that looked directly down over the massive ballroom. I walked to the carved stone railing and looked down at the spectacle below. It was a masterclass in performative delusion. Round tables were draped in fine white linen and covered in towering, extravagant floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Beatrice was dripping in vintage diamonds, holding court at the center table and laughing loudly with her society friends. David sat beside a rigid, furious Chloe, who was aggressively drinking champagne to hide her humiliation. Marcus sat at the head of the table, sweating profusely through his tuxedo, his eyes constantly darting toward the exits. He knew he was a dead man walking, but he was too terrified of his mother's wrath to cancel the party. Down below, Beatrice stood up from her chair. She smiled radiantly at her elite guests and tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing cut through the chatter, commanding the room's attention. "Family and distinguished friends," Beatrice announced, projecting her voice with aristocratic pride. "Thank you for joining us to celebrate 40 years of the Davis family legacy, a legacy built on unwavering success, prestige, and financial dominance. Let us raise a glass." Right as Beatrice lifted her flute, the heavy doors to the kitchen violently swung open. The entire fleet of waiters who had been poised to carry out silver platters of filet mignon abruptly stopped dead in their tracks. The string quartet faltered, the music dying out in a discordant screech. The event manager marched out of the kitchen, his face set in a grim, uncompromising line. He did not walk toward the microphone. He marched straight up to the head table, stopping directly behind Marcus's chair. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, awkward silence. Beatrice froze, her champagne glass hovering in the air. The event manager pulled a thick black leather billfold from under his arm. He slammed it down directly onto Marcus's pristine white dinner plate. The heavy smack echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous room. "Mr. Davis," the manager announced, his voice carrying clearly to every single table in the ballroom, "all of the credit cards on file for your account have just been flagged for insufficient funds. I am going to need an upfront alternate form of payment in full right now, or absolutely no food leaves my kitchen." Trent stopped dead in his tracks on the edge of the freshly cut church grass. The initial shock on his face rapidly mutated into a violently red, indignant rage. He grabbed Chloe tightly by the wrist, yanking her forward as he stomped away from the church steps and straight into the blazing hot asphalt of the parking lot. I descended the wooden stage, leaving Beatrice and the hysterical pregnant woman behind, and followed them directly to their luxury car. Trent spun around and marched right back into my personal space. He stood inches from my face, puffing his chest out to try and physically intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully," Trent snarled, pointing a thick finger right at my nose. "You might have just destroyed Marcus, but you do not get to drag us into your ghetto circus. I have a high-powered legal team on retainer. I am going to sue you into absolute oblivion for defamation, harassment, and emotional distress." Chloe cowered behind his broad shoulders, playing the fragile victim perfectly. She dabbed her dry eyes and wailed about how I was ruining her life out of pure jealousy. "Tell her," Trent, Chloe whimpered, digging her manicured nails into his sleeve. "Tell her she cannot treat us this way. We did nothing wrong. We are good people." Trent puffed up, even more emboldened by his role as the great white protector. "You crossed the wrong man today, Nia. My reputation in this city is bulletproof. No judge will ever take your side against me." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the finger pointing at my face, then looked up into Trent's furious blue eyes. I reached into the sleek leather tote bag slung over my shoulder and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slapped the heavy folder directly against Trent's chest. The sudden impact made him stumble backward, his hands instinctively coming up to catch it before it fell. "Open it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that completely erased his arrogant smirk. Trent hesitated, his fake bravado faltering just a fraction before he ripped the folder open. His eyes scanned the top page. The crimson flush of anger drained from his cheeks, instantly leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. Chloe peeked over his arm, her fake tears drying up as she looked at columns of highlighted financial data she could not comprehend. "What is this?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling as she looked back and forth between her husband and me. Trent could not answer. His mouth hung open in silent, suffocating terror. "I will tell you exactly what it is," I said, making sure my voice carried across the quiet parking lot so they could not escape the truth. "Those are the internal financial ledgers for Trent's prestigious real estate development firm. The same firm he loves to brag about at every single family dinner. The firm he uses to make himself feel superior to everyone else in our community. But as it turns out, Trent is not a brilliant businessman at all. His entire operation is nothing but a cheap, fraudulent shell company." Trent tried to close the folder, his hands shaking violently, but I grabbed the cover and forced it back open. Marcus did not just embezzle $8 million from his clients. I continued staring Trent down. He had to hide that money somewhere. He needed someone with a legitimate-looking corporate front, someone with the right skin color and the right country club memberships who would not draw any suspicion from federal regulators. He needed you, Trent. And you gladly took the job to fund your illusion of wealth. "You have been laundering Marcus's stolen millions for 3 years," I stated flatly, tapping the paper. "Every single one of those luxury condos you claim to have developed was funded by dirty stolen money. You knew exactly where the cash was coming from, and you happily took your 20% cut to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle. You are not a real provider. You are a glorified money launderer, hiding behind a tailored suit and unearned privilege." Yao built a house of cards using money stolen from hardworking families. Trent could not speak. The legal threats, the racial superiority, the arrogant bravado, it all evaporated into the humid summer air. He was clutching the physical proof of his federal crimes. He knew that if those ledgers made it to the authorities, his life as a wealthy, respected developer was completely over. He would lose the cars, the house, and his freedom. "You cannot prove I knew the origins of the funds," Trent stammered weakly, his voice cracking. "It was just a business investment. I am a victim of Marcus too." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that made Chloe flinch. "Do not insult my intelligence, Trent. I have the digital paper trail of your encrypted emails with Marcus discussing the exact wire transfer routes to dodge federal reporting requirements. I have the offshore account numbers. I have every single signature you forged." I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was completely invading his personal space. I leaned in close. Answering, Chloe could hear every single word I was about to say as she watched her perfect husband crumble into pieces. "You thought you could stand in my living room and make racist jokes about street mentality," I whispered, staring dead into his terrified eyes. "You thought your corporate title and your white privilege made you completely untouchable in my world. You thought you could disrespect me, tear down my character, and walk away without a single scratch. Well, let me formally introduce myself. I am not just a financial consultant. I am the senior managing director and majority shareholder of a massive private equity firm. We just bought all your toxic corporate bonds. I own your debt." Darlene's hands slammed hard against my shoulders, shoving me backward with enough force to make my stiletto catch on the uneven pavement. I stumbled but immediately regained my balance, my eyes locking onto the woman who had brought me into this world. Darlene did not even check to see if I had fallen. She threw herself onto the hot asphalt of the church parking lot, wrapping her arms protectively around Chloe and Trent. She stroked Trent's hair as the grown man wept completely, ignoring the fact that he was a criminal who had just threatened me. "Nia, have you lost your mind?" Darlene shrieked, her church hat knocked completely askew. "You are going to ruin this family over some paperwork. You need to stop this right now and destroy those ledgers. You need to forgive him. I stared down at her, feeling a cold, clinical detachment replacing decades of a daughter's yearning for maternal love. Forgive a man who helped launder stolen millions to fund your favorite daughter's lifestyle. I asked, my voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. He just threatened to sue me into oblivion. He mocked our entire community not 10 minutes ago. Darlene waved her hand frantically, dismissing my completely valid points, as if I were a child complaining about a scraped knee. He is just stressed, Nia. You are pushing him too hard. You need to be the bigger person here. You are a strong black woman, Nia. You are used to surviving hard things. You have always been the tough one. But Chloe is fragile. She has a sensitive spirit. She cannot handle a federal scandal. It would completely break her. The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. She was weaponizing the very resilience she forced me to build against me. She was using the strong black woman trope to justify sacrificing my well-being to protect a white man's fraudulent empire and her golden child's unearned comfort. She expected me to swallow my pride, absorb the trauma, and fix the mess just like I had done my entire life. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly reached back into my structured leather tote bag. If we are talking about surviving hard things, Darlene, let us talk about exactly why I had to become so strong in the first place, I said, my voice dangerously level. I pulled out a thick, slightly faded envelope. I had kept it locked in my personal safe for years, waiting for the day when the truth finally needed to see the light. I pulled out a stack of bank statements from 10 years ago and dropped the first page directly onto Trent's lap. Do you recognize this account number? I asked, staring dead into my mother's terrified eyes. It is the college trust fund my grandmother set up for me before she passed away. The one that was supposed to guarantee I would graduate debt-free. The one that miraculously vanished during my sophomore year. Darlene's face turned an ashen shade of gray. The manic energy of her defense instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, guilty silence. Chloe stopped crying and looked down at the bank statements, genuine confusion crossing her tear-stained face. For 10 years you told me the market crashed and the investments went bad. I continued, my voice amplifying, so the lingering church elders standing near their cars could hear every single word. You watched me work night shifts at a diner. You watched me take out predatory student loans that took me almost a decade to pay off. You watched me cry myself to sleep from exhaustion, telling me that struggle builds character. I flipped to the second page and held it up. But the market did not crash, did it, Darlene? You forged my signature on the withdrawal authorization forms. You emptied $35,000 out of my account in a single afternoon. Darlene scrambled to her feet, her hands reaching out in a desperate, trembling panic. Nia, please keep your voice down. We are at church. People are listening. I stepped out of her reach, holding the papers higher. Let them listen. Let everyone hear how the pious, respectable church mother actually operates behind closed doors. I pointed directly at Chloe, who was now staring at her mother in horror. You stole my future to pay for Chloe's luxury gap year in Europe. You funded her shopping trips in Paris, her villa in Rome, and her yacht parties on the Amalfi Coast using my tuition money. I did it because she needed to find herself. Darlene cried out, her voice cracking as she frantically tried to justify the ultimate betrayal. You were always so smart, Nia. You always figured things out. You did not need the money to succeed, but your sister needed the experience to build her confidence. I knew you would find a way to graduate. You always survive. The collective gasp from the remaining church congregation echoed across the asphalt. The mothers who had previously sided with Darlene were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. Darlene had crossed the ultimate line. She had stolen from her own child to spoil another, and then praised my forced survival as an excuse for her blatant theft. You broke my back to build her a pedestal. I stated the finality of the realization settling deep into my bones. You let me drown so she could float. And now you expect me to protect the criminal she married just to preserve her delicate feelings. Chloe looked absolutely sick. Trent remained on the ground, realizing that the protective wall Darlene was trying to build had just been utterly obliterated. Darlene took a trembling step toward me, tears ruining her perfectly applied Sunday makeup. Please, Nia. I will do anything. I will pay you back every single cent. Just please do not turn Trent over to the FBI. Do not destroy Chloe's life. I am begging you as your mother. I looked at the woman who had prioritized everyone else over me for 32 years. I looked at the sheer desperation in her eyes, driven entirely by her need to protect her golden child at any cost. A cold, calculating smile spread across my face. "You want to save your golden child?" I asked, my tone dropping to a sharp, clinical whisper. "Fine, I will give you a chance to save her perfect little life. But it is going to cost you the one thing you care about most in this entire world, your reputation." I reached back into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek black folder. I pulled out a premium bonded stack of papers and dropped a heavy silver pen on top of them. "What is this?" Darlene whispered, her voice trembling as she looked from the papers to my unyielding face. "It is your way out," I said coldly. "You are looking at a legally binding severance of relationship agreement, paired with an ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. If you sign those pages, you are legally and permanently severing all maternal ties to me. You are forfeiting any and all future grandparents' rights to Zuri. You will never see my daughter again. You will never speak my name in public. You will never attempt to contact me, claim me, or ask me for a single dime. But more importantly, the second page contains a full written confession acknowledging that you forged my signature and stole $35,000 from my college trust fund 10 years ago." Darlene recoiled as if I had struck her across the face. "I will not sign a confession," she gasped, shaking her head frantically. "If that gets out my position at the church, my reputation in the community, everything will be completely destroyed. People will call me a thief." "You are a thief," I corrected sharply. "And right now you have to decide who you love more, your pristine church reputation or your precious golden child. If you sign that paper, admitting your theft and legally disowning me forever, I will give Trent exactly 30 days to liquidate his fraudulent assets and pay back the debt he owes my private equity firm. I will give him a 1-month head start before I hand these ledgers over to the federal agents who just hauled my husband away." Trent looked up from the pavement, his blue eyes wide with desperate hope. 30 days was enough time to sell off properties, hide cash, and prepare a defense. "If you refuse to sign," I continued, my gaze locked on my mother, "I am calling the FBI right now. Trent will be in federal custody by dinner time. Chloe will be investigated as an accomplice to money laundering. They will lose the house, the cars, and their freedom. So make your choice. Sign the paper and save Chloe, or keep your pride and watch them both go to prison." Darlene stared at the silver pen, her hands shaking violently. For her entire life, her image in the African American community was everything. Being a respected church elder, a flawless matriarch, and a woman of high social standing was her lifeblood. Admitting to stealing from her own flesh and blood to spoil her favorite daughter would make her an absolute pariah. "Mom, please," Chloe shrieked, breaking the silence. She grabbed Darlene by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "You have to sign it. You cannot let them take Trent away. I cannot go to jail, Mom. Please. You said you would always protect me. You said I was your priority. Sign the paper." Darlene looked at Chloe, watching her golden child completely melt down in the church parking lot. Then she looked down at Trent, the white savior she had idolized, who was now weeping on the ground like a pathetic coward. Finally, she looked at me. She searched my face for any hint of bluffing, any sign of the obedient, desperate daughter who used to beg for her affection. She found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened resolve. I was no longer her scapegoat. I was her reckoning. With a trembling hand, Darlene reached out and picked up the silver pen. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She placed the documents against the hood of my armored SUV. Her hand shook so badly she could barely form the letters, but under the hysterical screams of Chloe begging her to hurry, Darlene pressed the pen to the paper. She signed the confession. She signed the non-disclosure agreement. She signed away her rights to me and to Zuri, legally severing our bloodline forever. When she finished, she dropped the pen onto the asphalt. She did not look at me. She just turned around and wrapped her arms tightly around Chloe, sobbing into her golden daughter's shoulder. I stepped forward and calmly picked up the documents. I checked the signatures, ensuring every line was properly endorsed. I slipped the papers back into the black folder and placed them securely inside my tote bag. A profound, hollow sensation washed over me. I was completely dead inside regarding the woman standing in front of me, but at the exact same time, a massive, crushing weight lifted off my shoulders. I was finally liberated from decades of toxic family loyalty. I owed them nothing. "You have 30 days, Trent," I stated, turning my back on the pathetic scene of my former family weeping in the parking lot. "I suggest you start packing." I walked toward the driver's side of my SUV. I felt nothing but a chilling sense of victory. My security team stood by, quietly ensuring I was completely untouched as I opened the heavy bulletproof door of my vehicle. I slid into the drive, the cool air conditioning instantly washing over my face. I placed my tote bag on the passenger seat and took a deep, cleansing breath. The hardest part was over. I had systematically dismantled every person who had tried to destroy me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to check on Zuri's nanny. Before I could open the security application, the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. I tapped the screen, my eyes scanning the short, terrifying sentence glowing in bright white letters against the dark background. Bail posted. "I am coming for the kid." My blood ran completely ice cold in my veins. Marcus was officially out and looking for our daughter. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the harsh white text burning into my retinas. Bail posted. "I am coming for the kid." The words were short, but the implication was catastrophic. The federal magistrate had set his bail at a staggering amount, expecting him to sit in a holding cell until his trial. They drastically underestimated his corruption and his absolute desperation. Marcus had tapped into his hidden offshore accounts, the dark money he had been funneling through Trent's fraudulent shell companies for years. He had wired untraceable funds through a proxy to buy his temporary freedom, and now, driven completely mad by the absolute destruction of his pristine reputation at the church cookout, he was hunting for the one thing he could use to hurt me. He blamed me for his public humiliation in front of his mother. He blamed me for the pregnant escort showing up and ruining his perfect facade. He blamed me for his federal indictment. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, I was the villain who ruined his perfect life, and Zuri was his ultimate leverage to force my submission. I locked my phone and tapped the reinforced glass divider separating the back seat from the driver. "Take us to the primary residence," I instructed my security driver, keeping my voice dangerously level. "We are not going back to that fake suburban house." My driver gave a single curt nod and whipped the heavy armored SUV around a tight corner. We sped away from the church parking lot, leaving my mother and her golden child sobbing on the asphalt, and headed straight toward the heart of downtown Sacramento. For the past 2 years, I had maintained the illusion of living in that overpriced, drafty suburban house Beatrice claimed as her own. It was a tactical performance. I played the role of the submissive wife in a home that never belonged to me, tolerating their endless disrespect while quietly building my empire. But my actual residence, the ultimate fortress I purchased under a highly encrypted corporate LLC, was a $15 million ultra-secure penthouse, occupying the entire top floor of the most exclusive high-rise in the city. Nobody in my toxic family knew it existed. To them, I was just a financially dependent woman, lucky to be married to a wealthy man. To the real estate market, I was a ghost who bought luxury properties in pure cash. The SUV descended into the secure underground parking garage of the high-rise. My private security team was already on high alert, moving swiftly to flank the vehicle as soon as the doors opened. I stepped out, holding Zuri tight against my chest. My daughter was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the violent storm raging around us. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, using a private biometric elevator that scanned my retina before shooting us up 40 stories into the sky. The elevator doors slid open to reveal my true sanctuary. The penthouse featured floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass overlooking the entire Sacramento skyline. Imported Italian marble stretched across the vast foyer, and state-of-the-art surveillance screens lined the hallway walls. It was a fortress, disguised as a modern architectural masterpiece. I immediately called for Elena, my trusted live-in nanny, who had been waiting for our return. She took one look at my face and knew the protocol. Take Zuri to the safe room right now, I ordered, handing over my sleeping daughter. Do not come out until I personally enter the passcode. No matter what you hear, stay locked inside. Elena nodded grimly. She carried Zuri down the hall and pressed her hand against a hidden panel disguised as a bookshelf. The heavy reinforced steel door of the panic room slid open. The steel door sealed shut behind them with a heavy, reassuring locking mechanism. Zuri was untouchable, with my daughter completely safe. I walked into the expansive living room and dropped my designer tote bag onto the sleek leather sofa. I slipped off my gold stiletto heels, preferring to feel the cold, solid marble beneath my bare feet. I did not pace. I did not panic. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the kitchen island and stood in the center of the room waiting. I knew Marcus was coming. I wanted him to come. I wanted him to walk right into the trap of his own arrogance. 10 minutes passed in absolute suffocating silence. Then the advanced security tablet resting on the kitchen counter flashed a bright, angry crimson. A silent alarm triggered on the screen, indicating a forced breach in the lobby protocols. My eyes narrowed as I watched the live high-definition security feed. Marcus was not alone. He had cornered the building manager, a corrupt man who had a history of accepting bribes to look the other way. Marcus had clearly paid off, using whatever dirty cash he had left to obtain a master override keycard. I watched the screen as Marcus shoved the building manager aside and swiped the stolen keycard into the primary elevator. The digital numbers on the display began climbing rapidly. I was bypassing the biometric scanners. The elevator was shooting straight up to the 40th floor. The mechanical hum of the elevator shaft grew louder and louder. A sharp melodic ding chimed through the penthouse. The elevator doors slid open. A heavy combat boot kicked violently against the custom double doors of my foyer. The thick wood splintered and slammed open with explosive force. Marcus stumbled into my home, panting heavily, his designer suit torn. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. He looked like a madman who had lost his entire grip on reality, and clutched tightly in his right hand, pointed directly at my chest, was a loaded black handgun. "Where is she?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate feral edge that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of my foyer. "Where is my daughter Nia? Bring her out right now." He waved the heavy black handgun erratically, his hand shaking violently. He took a stumbling step forward, his boots leaving dirty scuff marks across my pristine white Italian marble floors. As he moved, his frantic eyes darted around the massive entryway. He stopped for a fraction of a second, his brain struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the wealth surrounding him. He stared at the custom crystal chandelier cascading from the ceiling and the authentic modern art pieces lining the gallery walls. The reality of his surroundings crashed into his fractured mind like a freight train. "You have been hiding this." Marcus gasped, his chest heaving as he lowered the gun just an inch in pure disbelief. "This place is worth millions. You let me risk federal prison to scrape together a few $1,000,000, and you were sitting on an absolute fortune this entire time. You let me look like a fool." His shock quickly morphed back into violent, unhinged rage. He lashed out, swinging his free hand and knocking a priceless glass sculpture off a pedestal. It shattered into 1,000 pieces across the marble. He stomped over the broken shards, raising the gun and pointing it directly at my face. "I want my kid and I want my money," Marcus demanded, spit flying from his lips. "You are going to wire $5 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I have the routing number right here. Do it now, Nia, or I swear I will pull this trigger. I will take Zuri and I will disappear. You ruined my life today. You humiliated my mother. You set me up to be a laughingstock at that church. You owe me everything." How was a pathetic sight. A grown man stripped of his designer facade, throwing a temper tantrum with a deadly weapon because his fraudulent empire had collapsed. He expected me to cower. He expected me to drop to my knees, beg for my life, and cry for mercy. That was the dynamic he was used to enforcing in our fake suburban marriage. He wanted to feel like a powerful man, taking what he believed was rightfully his. Instead, I sat perfectly still on my emerald green velvet sofa. I crossed my legs, smoothing out the fabric of my ivory trousers. I reached over to the marble side table, picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, refreshing sip. The carbonation burned pleasantly down my throat. I lowered the glass and looked at the barrel of his gun. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg. I simply smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. "You really are not very smart, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing smoothly through the expansive penthouse. "You think you can just kick down a door and make demands. You think you are the one in control because you are holding a piece of metal. But you failed to recognize where you are standing." I set my glass down with a soft clink. "This is not the cheap, drafty suburban house your mother pretended to own. This is a $15 million fortress. Do you honestly believe a woman who orchestrates hostile takeovers of international financial institutions would leave herself unprotected in her own home? Do you think I would bring my daughter here if it were not the safest place on the planet?" Marcus tightened his grip on the gun, his breathing growing ragged. "Shut up!" he yelled, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "Transfer the money right now or I will end you." I ignored his outburst and leaned back into the plush velvet cushions. "When you kicked down my front door, you breached the primary perimeter," I explained, keeping my tone conversational, as if I were lecturing a slow intern. "But you did not realize that the Italian marble you are currently scuffing up is heavily modified. You are standing directly on the pressure plates of the most advanced private military security system in California. The moment your foot hit that floor without the proper biometric clearance, this entire penthouse went into a full lockdown protocol. Zuri is perfectly safe in a reinforced steel panic room that you could never penetrate." Marcus froze, his eyes dropping to the floor and then snapping back up to me. "You are bluffing," he stammered, though the unmistakable tremor in his voice betrayed his absolute terror. "You are just trying to buy time. Get up and transfer the money." "I am not bluffing, Marcus, and I am certainly not giving you $5 million. You see, the funny thing about dark money and offshore accounts is that they are highly susceptible to seizure if you know the right federal agents. But right now, your biggest problem is not the FBI. Your biggest problem is the pressure plate beneath your left boot. You are out of moves and you are completely out of time." I watched as a tiny glowing red dot appeared out of nowhere. It hovered for a second on the white wall behind him before snapping directly onto the center of Marcus's chest, right over his racing heart. Marcus gasped, his eyes crossing slightly as he looked down at the bright red laser sight illuminating his torn dress shirt. Before he could even process what was happening, the shadows of the expansive foyer seemed to detach themselves from the walls. 4 towering figures clad in pitch-black tactical gear stepped silently into the light. They were private, highly trained military-grade security contractors, and they moved with terrifying lethal synchronization. They raised their weapons in perfect unison, the cold steel of 4 fully automatic assault rifles aimed directly at his head. Marcus froze, the color draining from his face as the reality of the 4 assault rifles registered in his fractured mind. Before he could twitch a finger toward his handgun, the contractors moved without shouting warnings, executing a tactical disarmament with effortless precision. The lead contractor lunged forward, gripping Marcus by the wrist and twisting his arm at a sharp, unnatural angle. Marcus dropped the weapon instantly, letting out a sharp cry of pain as the metal clattered across the foyer. A second contractor kicked the back of Marcus's knees, sending him crashing downward. One contractor drove a heavy combat boot firmly between Marcus's shoulder blades, pinning him to the floor. Marcus thrashed violently against the stone, his expensive suit tearing at the seams. His previous arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, pathetic flailing of a cornered animal. "Get off me!" Marcus screamed, spitting blood onto the marble. "Let me go right now. I am her husband. I have rights. You cannot do this to me. I am Marcus Davenport. I demand my rights." Even now, face down in the dirt of his own making, he believed his title as my husband granted him some supreme authority over my life and my property. He truly believed the patriarchal shield would save him from the consequences of his own fraud. I slowly stood up. My bare feet felt the chill of the marble as I walked over to where I had dropped my gold stiletto heels earlier. I stopped right beside his head, looking down at his bruised and panicked face. He craned his neck, struggling against the heavy boot pinning him down, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and terror. Nia, tell them to let me up, he demanded, still trying to issue orders from the floor. I am your husband. We can work this out. I did not respond with words right away. Instead, I raised my right foot and brought the sharp point of my gold stiletto down directly onto his restrained wrist. I pressed my weight into the heel, grinding the metal tip into his skin just enough to elicit a sharp, agonizing gasp from his lips. You permanently lost the right to call yourself my husband, the exact moment you slammed that fake DNA test onto my glass coffee table. I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy whisper that chilled the massive foyer. You lost your rights the moment you tried to cast me and my daughter out onto the street to protect your stolen millions. You thought you were so brilliant, Marcus. You thought you could outsmart everyone, including the woman you slept next to every night. Marcus winced, trying to pull his arm away, but the security team held him completely immobile. I pressed the stiletto down a fraction harder, ensuring he gave me his undivided attention. You came here demanding $5 million. I continued pacing slowly around his prone body. You thought you were throwing your weight around, but you failed to understand the magnitude of the woman you tried to discard. When I told Trent that my private equity firm froze his accounts, I left out a crucial piece of information. Marcus stared up at me, his chest heaving, a new wave of dread washing over his features. What are you talking about? He stammered, his bravado entirely crushed. My firm did not just permanently freeze your illicit offshore accounts, I explained, savoring every single syllable. We did not just buy up Trent's toxic corporate bonds. While you were busy making a fool of yourself at the church cookout, my team was executing a massive coordinated hostile takeover of your parent brokerage firm. The board of directors signed the paperwork at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Marcus's eyes widened to a completely impossible degree. He gasped for air as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the penthouse. No, he whispered, shaking his head against the marble. That is impossible. You do not have that kind of capital. I am the senior managing director and the secret undisputed majority shareholder, I stated flatly, crouching down, so I was eye level with his horrified face. I bought the firm, Marcus. I bought your entire corporate structure. I bought the very desk you sit at. I am not just the woman you tried to frame. I am technically your boss. I am your primary debt holder, and as of today, I am your executioner. You have absolutely nothing left. Your money, your reputation, your career, it all belongs to me now. Marcus let out a pathetic guttural sob, dropping his sweaty forehead against the hard marble floor as the sheer devastating reality of his total and complete financial ruin finally registered. His entire life had been dismantled and purchased by the black woman he had spent years trying to control and diminish. He was completely broke, facing federal prison, and literally pinned under the boot of my security team. I stood back up, adjusting my ivory blazer, feeling a profound sense of closure. I had systematically and thoroughly destroyed his fraudulent empire. But there was one final critical loose thread that needed to be tied up before the authorities dragged him away for good. The heavy, shattered remains of the custom double doors at the entrance of the penthouse suddenly shifted. The biometric elevator in the private lobby chimed a crisp, melodic note, signaling another arrival. Marcus snapped his head up, desperate for any sign of salvation. The polished silver elevator doors slid smoothly open. It was definitely not a rescue party. Stepping through the ruined doorway was the young, heavily pregnant woman from the church lawn. Flanking her on either side were two of my top corporate litigation lawyers, carrying thick leather briefcases. The pregnant escort had arrived, and she was finally ready to talk to us about absolutely everything concerning his pathetic web of lies and all his financial manipulation right here and now. The two litigators stepped aside, allowing the young woman to walk into the foyer. She no longer looked like the hysterical victim who had crashed the church cookout today. Her posture was upright, her expression hardened into a rigid mask of unadulterated contempt. She looked down at Marcus, who was pinned beneath the combat boot of my security contractor. Marcus stared up at her, his eyes wide with panicked confusion. "What are you doing here?" he choked out, struggling weakly against the pressure on his spine. "You were supposed to stay at the condo. You were supposed to wait for my call." The woman did not answer him. Instead, she reached around to the small of her back and unzipped the side of her maternity dress. With a swift motion, she unhooked a series of hidden straps. A heavy silicone prosthetic belly dropped from her waist and hit the marble floor with a dull thud. Marcus stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack as he stared at the silicone prop resting near his face. "Allow me to introduce the true Sterling bloodline," I said, my voice echoing with sarcasm. I walked around the fake belly and looked down at my soon-to-be ex-husband. "You honestly thought you were a criminal mastermind, Marcus. You thought you could orchestrate a massive public scandal to force my hand." I turned to the security contractors and my legal team, making sure everyone heard the absolute depths of his depravity. This woman is not a naive mistress who fell in love. She is a highly exclusive escort. Marcus hired her for a flat fee of $50,000. He specifically paid her to wear a prosthetic belly and crash a family gathering to claim he was the father of her unborn child. Marcus groaned, closing his eyes as his master plan was laid bare in the bright lights of my penthouse. I had two goals. I continued pacing slowly around his prone body. First, he wanted to publicly humiliate me into accepting a fast, destitute divorce settlement, leaving him free to quietly hide his embezzled $8 million. And second, his fragile, sterile ego desperately needed his mother to believe he was capable of fathering a child. He was willing to buy a fake baby just to prove he was a real man. The escort crossed her arms over her perfectly flat stomach and glared down at the pathetic man on the floor. "You promised me 50 grand up front," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You told me the wire transfer was clearing this morning. You set me up in that leased condo and swore that as soon as the church stunt was over, my offshore account would be funded. But I checked my balances, Marcus. The money never arrived." She stepped closer, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone. "When I walked onto that church lawn and watched your wife pull out certified medical records proving you are 100% sterile, I knew something was wrong. But when I heard you were facing federal embezzlement charges, I did the math. I realized you were completely broke. You are nothing but a cheap con artist who tried to use me to cover up your federal crimes." I smiled, admiring her ruthless business sense. The moment she realized Marcus was a sinking ship, she made a very smart, very lucrative pivot. She bypassed Marcus completely and contacted the corporate numbers associated with my private equity firm. My lawyers intercepted her call, and we negotiated a much better deal. She agreed to turn over every single piece of evidence in exchange for full immunity and a generous compensation package for her time. The escort reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a cheap black burner phone. She held it out to me. "This contains every single text message, every encrypted email, and every voice note Marcus sent me over the past 3 weeks," she announced. "It outlines his entire extortion plan. It shows exactly how he planned to hide the stolen client funds during the divorce proceedings. It even has his messages complaining about his mother and how he planned to leave her with the remaining debt once he fled the country." I took the burner phone from her hand and slipped it into the pocket of my ivory blazer. The final nail in his coffin was officially secured. Marcus began to weep. It was not the angry, frustrated crying of a man who had been caught making a mistake. It was the deep, guttural sobbing of a man who realized his entire existence was completely and utterly over. He had no money, no leverage, no family, and no future. I was lying face down on the floor of a $15 million penthouse owned by the black woman he had spent years trying to diminish and destroy. "Please, Nia," Marcus sobbed, tears and saliva pooling on the marble beneath his face. "Please do not do this. I am begging you. I have nothing left. I am going to rot in prison. Have mercy on me, please." I looked down at the man who had brought a fake DNA test into my home just a few hours ago, attempting to rip my daughter away from me and throw me out onto the street. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but a cold, satisfying sense of absolute justice. "You made your bed, Marcus," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Now you get to lie in it for a very, very long time." But I was not quite finished. I raised my left wrist and tapped the screen of my smartwatch. "You can come in now," I said clearly into the device. The heavy, solid oak doors of my private guest suite swung open with a resounding thud. The lead FBI agent, The exact same tall, stern-faced man who had slapped the cuffs on Marcus in Beatrice's tacky suburban living room just days prior, stepped out into the brightly lit corridor. I was not alone. Two heavily armed federal marshals flanked him, their expressions completely devoid of any sympathy. I had forwarded the dark money bail notification to my federal contacts the exact second it hit my phone back at the church parking lot. When you control billions of dollars in corporate debt, you keep very powerful friends on speed dial. I invited the agents into my penthouse through the private service elevator before Marcus even bypassed the lobby. They had been sitting comfortably in my guest suite this entire time, listening to every single word through the live audio feed connected directly to my smartwatch. Marcus went completely rigid under the heavy combat boot of my security contractor. The breath hitched in his throat. His bloodshot eyes darted from the federal agents back to me, the horrific realization finally crashing down on him. This was never just a random home invasion. It was a perfectly executed, federally monitored trap. The lead agent buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly across the imported marble, his polished shoes crunching over the shards of the glass sculpture Marcus had shattered moments earlier. He looked down at the pathetic weeping man on the floor with absolute professional disgust. Marcus Davenport, the agent, announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You were granted a highly contested temporary federal bail mere hours ago. Since your release, you have illegally procured a loaded firearm. You have broken into a highly secure private residence. You have committed felony extortion by demanding $5 million, and you explicitly stated your intention to flee the jurisdiction to the Cayman Islands. The agent gestured to the security contractors, signaling them to step back. The contractors released their hold, but Marcus did not even try to run. His legs were essentially paralyzed by pure terror. The federal marshals grabbed Marcus by his torn designer suit jacket and violently hauled him up off the marble floor. They slammed him face first against the nearest wall, ignoring his cries of pain as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The harsh metallic sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut cut through the penthouse once again. Your bail is officially and permanently revoked, the lead agent stated flatly, pulling out his notepad. You are being transferred directly to a maximum security federal holding facility. There will be no further hearings regarding your release. You will remain incarcerated until your trial, where we will now be adding armed home invasion, extortion, and witness intimidation to your incredibly long list of federal charges. Marcus thrashed against the heavy grip of the marshals. The reality of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary broke whatever shred of sanity he had left. He twisted his neck, looking back at me with wild, desperate eyes. The sheer audacity of his next move proved exactly how manipulative and toxic he had always been. Nia, please, Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. You cannot let them take me away forever. I am your husband. We loved each other. We built a life together. I gave you the family you always wanted. I stood by you. Please, Nia. Just tell them you invited me here. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will sign whatever divorce papers you want. I will walk away with nothing. Just give me one more chance. I stared at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. He dared to invoke the word love after forcing me to sign a non-disclosure agreement to protect his fragile ego, after trying to throw me out on the street with a fake DNA test, and after hiring an escort to publicly humiliate me in front of my entire community. He spent years treating me like a submissive accessory, letting his mother Beatrice belittle my skin tone, my background, and my worth, all while he secretly drained innocent people's bank accounts to buy luxury watches. I walked slowly toward him, my bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. I stopped just inches from his face, completely unbothered by his hysterical sobbing. You did not build a life with me, Marcus, I said, my voice steady, sharp, and dripping with absolute finality. You built a stage and you expected me to play the grateful, silent black wife in the background while your mother treated me like a peasant. You thought my ultimate goal in life was merely to secure a seat at your elitist, fraudulent table. I leaned in closer so he could hear the full weight of his destruction. There was not enough space for me at your table, Marcus, so I bought the restaurant. The lead agent nodded to the marshals. Get him out of here. The marshals jerked Marcus backward, dragging him forcefully toward the waiting biometric elevator. Marcus kicked and thrashed his designer shoes, sliding uselessly across the marble foyer. He screamed my name, his voice tearing at his vocal cords, echoing with absolute bottomless despair. He pleaded, he cursed, he sobbed, but I did not blink. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, watching the elevator doors slide open. The marshals shoved him inside. Marcus fell against the back wall of the metal cab, his face twisted in a mask of pure agony. He looked at me one last time, realizing his empire was gone, his freedom was gone, and the woman he underestimated had orchestrated every single second of his downfall. The polished silver doors slid shut, cutting off his desperate screams and sealing his fate forever. Silence returned to the penthouse. The heavy, chaotic energy dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, clean sense of absolute victory. The lead FBI agent thanked me for my cooperation, collected the burner phone from the escort, and escorted both women out of my home to take their official statements. I stood alone in my foyer, surrounded by the remnants of Marcus's failed intrusion. I took a deep, feeling the tension permanently leave my shoulders. I reached into my pocket to check the security feed for the panic room, ready to release Elena and my beautiful daughter Zuri. Before I could open the camera application, my phone vibrated in my palm. The screen lit up with a high-priority automated email notification from my private equity firm's legal department. I tapped the screen and read the bold text. Legal notice. Foreclosure proceedings finalized. Eviction enforcement at Beatrice Davenport's primary residence is officially scheduled for 8:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. Local sheriff dispatch confirmed. I locked my phone and smiled. Marcus was locked in a federal cage, but the night was not over yet. Tomorrow morning, the queen of the country club was going to be thrown out onto the street. The morning sun rose over the manicured lawns of Sacramento's most exclusive suburban neighborhood. At exactly 8:00 a.m., the pristine quiet of the cul-de-sac was shattered by the heavy rumble of official county vehicles. Beatrice Davenport was inside her lavish kitchen, draped in a pure silk robe, sipping expensive imported coffee. Even after the catastrophic humiliation at the church yesterday, her elitist illusion remained completely intact. She firmly believed that her social standing would somehow protect her from the consequences of her son's actions. She assumed Marcus would call his high-priced lawyers, fix the mess, and restore their family name by the weekend. She had absolutely no idea that her son was currently sitting in a sterile federal holding cell, stripped of his custom-tailored suit and his dignity. A sharp, aggressive pounding echoed through the grand entryway of the house Beatrice claimed to own. She set her coffee cup down with an annoyed huff, tightening the belt of her silk robe. She marched toward the front door, fully prepared to scold whatever delivery driver or neighborhood association board member dared to disturb her morning peace. She swung the heavy oak door open with a dramatic flourish. Instead of a delivery driver, 3 Sacramento County sheriffs stood on her oversized welcome mat. Their hands rested professionally on their utility belts, their expressions completely devoid of patience or sympathy. Behind them, a massive moving truck was idling in the driveway, and a crew of men in matching uniforms stood ready with heavy-duty trash bags and moving dollies. Beatrice Davenport, the lead sheriff, stated, holding up a thick stack of legal documents attached to a clipboard. "We are executing a court-ordered foreclosure and immediate eviction notice for this property. The primary lien holder officially took possession of this asset yesterday. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your vital medication and identification before we remove you from the premises." Beatrice stared at the sheriff, her jaw dropping in sheer outrage. The color drained from her face as the words washed over her. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, her voice cracking with indignant fury. "You have the wrong house. I am a prominent member of this community. My son is a wealthy executive. We do not get evicted. I demand you leave my property right now before I call the chief of police." The sheriff did not flinch. He simply signaled to the moving crew. "Proceed with the asset removal," he ordered. Beatrice completely lost her mind. She lunged forward, trying to physically block the men from entering the house. The sheriffs immediately intervened. They grabbed her by the arms, effortlessly subduing her frantic thrashing, and forcefully marched her out of the front door. Beatrice kicked her bare feet against the pavement, screaming at the top of her lungs, her pure silk robe flapping wildly in the morning breeze. "Get your hands off me!" she wailed, crying genuine tears of absolute panic. "You cannot do this. I am Beatrice Davenport. I belong here." The sheriffs deposited her roughly onto the edge of her perfectly manicured front lawn. She stumbled and fell onto the grass, completely humiliated, as the neighbors began stepping out of their million-dollar homes to watch the spectacle. Women from her bridge club, deacons from the church, and rival socialites stood on their porches whispering and pointing as the queen of the neighborhood was reduced to a screaming, disheveled mess. The movers wasted absolutely no time. They marched into the house and began hauling out the tangible proof of her elitist lifestyle. Custom velvet sofas were dragged out and dumped unceremoniously onto the driveway. Antique vases, expensive rugs, and crystal lamps were boxed up and shoved outside. Then came the designer bags. Dozens of luxury purses, the very items Beatrice had used to flaunt her superiority over me and other black women in our community, were tossed out in black heavy-duty trash bags. They landed with a pathetic thud next to her on the damp morning grass. A sleek black armored SUV turned onto the quiet street, its heavy tires rolling slowly over the pavement. The vehicle glided to a smooth stop right in front of the pile of discarded luxury goods. The dark-tinted window of the back seat rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. I sat comfortably in the spacious leather interior, holding a fresh cup of coffee. I wore a tailored crimson suit, looking every bit the wealthy, untouchable executive she had always tried to pretend I was not. I looked out the window at Beatrice. She was sitting in the dirt, clutching one of her discarded designer bags. Her hair a tangled mess, her silk robe covered in grass stains. She looked up and locked eyes with me. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. I was not just the woman who exposed her son. I was the primary lien holder. I was the private equity firm that bought her debt. I was the reason she was sitting on the street. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I simply raised my hand and gave her a slow, polite, devastating wave. Beatrice let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe had been permanently destroyed. She collapsed onto the pile of black trash bags, burying her face in her hands, finally understanding that her elitist world was gone forever, and she had absolutely no one to blame but herself. I tapped the glass divider, signaling my driver to move forward. As the SUV rolled away from the ruined matriarch, my focus shifted to the next target. I had promised my mother that I would give Trent 30 days to liquidate his assets if she signed the severance agreement. But Darlene's signature meant absolutely nothing to the federal government, and I was not a woman who left loose ends. Miles away in the heart of the downtown business district, Trent was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in his corner office. He was furiously typing on his computer, sweating through his designer shirt as he frantically tried to wire whatever hidden funds he had left to an offshore account in Mexico. He thought my 30-day promise had bought him a window of safety. He thought his white privilege would shield him from the immediate consequences of his massive financial crimes. The glass doors of his real estate firm shattered inward. Trent bolted upright, his chair rolling backward and crashing into the window behind him. Dozens of federal agents stormed into the corporate office, heavily armed and shouting commands. They carried the exact same financial ledgers I had handed to Trent in the church parking lot. His empire was imploding rapidly, tearing down every single lie he had ever told. The arrogant savior was finally facing the ultimate inescapable reckoning. He raised his hands in absolute defeat, knowing the privilege he weaponized for years could not save him from the cold steel of federal handcuffs. When federal agents breached the glass doors of his real estate firm, Trent's instinct for self-preservation took over. He did not wait for the cold steel of handcuffs to lock around his wrists. As agents shouted commands in the corporate lobby, Trent slammed his palm against the emergency fire alarm button hidden beneath his mahogany desk. The deafening siren and flashing strobe lights created a fraction of a second of blinding chaos. That was all the time he needed. Trent bolted through the private executive door at the back of his office and plunged into the restricted stairwell. He realized with terrifying clarity that my 30-day extension was a complete illusion. Darlene signing a meaningless piece of paper in a church parking lot meant nothing to the federal government. I had handed over his fraudulent financial ledgers to the authorities the exact moment I drove away from that parking lot. I never had any intention of letting him walk away. Trent sprinted down 4 flights of stairs, his breath burning in his lungs. He burst into the executive parking garage and ran straight to a hidden wall safe he kept near his private parking space. His hands shook violently as he punched in the code. He ripped open the metal door and shoved stacks of emergency cash, a secondary passport, and a prepaid burner phone into a duffel bag. Most importantly, he did not call his fragile, beloved wife. He abandoned Chloe without a single second of hesitation. He threw his bag into his secondary sports car, put the vehicle in drive, and sped out of the garage, heading straight south toward the Mexican border. He drove for hours, sweating through his shirt, jumping at every siren. He truly believed his privilege and confident smile would allow him to slip right through the border checkpoint. But I had already flagged his secondary passport with my federal contacts. When Trent pulled his sports car up to the San Isidro port of entry, he handed his passport to the border agent with a fake, practiced grin. The agent scanned the document. Instantly, the booth illuminated with a silent red alert. Before Trent could even process the delay, a dozen heavily armed Border Patrol agents swarmed his vehicle. They dragged the arrogant developer out of his luxury car by his collar and slammed him face down onto the hot concrete. Trent wept into the dust, his escape plan completely shattered. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, Chloe was frantically packing her designer luggage. She was completely unaware that her husband was currently eating dirt at the border. She honestly thought Trent was handling the situation with his high-powered lawyers. She expected him to walk through the front door and tell her everything was fine, just like he always did. Instead, her front door was kicked violently off its hinges. A specialized financial crimes task force stormed into her home, armed with federal seizure warrants. Chloe screamed, threatening to call the police. The lead investigator handed her a thick stack of legal indictments. He coldly informed her that Trent had been arrested attempting to flee the country. Chloe dropped her bag, her entire world spinning out of control. The investigator was not finished. He pointed to the documents and explained the devastating reality of her situation. Because Chloe had happily signed as a co-director on all of Trent's shell companies to boost her social status, she was now legally liable for millions of dollars in federal restitution. The agents informed her that all of her bank accounts were permanently frozen. Her credit cards were declined. They were seizing her cars, her jewelry, and the very house she was standing in right now. She was ordered to vacate the premises immediately. The golden child, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, was shoved out of her own front door by federal agents. She was left standing on the sidewalk with zero assets, a staggering mountain of criminal debt, and a husband facing decades in federal prison. Panicking and completely destitute, Chloe did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran to her mother. She walked for miles in her expensive heels, sobbing hysterically, until she reached Darlene's house. She expected the front door to swing open. She expected open arms, a warm bed, and Darlene's usual protective shield. She stumbled up the driveway, calling out for her mother to save her. But the front door was firmly locked. Chloe wiped her tear-stained face and looked closer. A bright yellow notice was plastered directly across the wood of the front door. It was a federal seizure notice from the Internal Revenue Service. Chloe heard a soft, pathetic whimpering sound coming from the edge of the property. She turned and saw Darlene sitting on the hard concrete curb next to a single black garbage bag of clothes. Darlene looked up at her golden child, her face pale and devoid of her usual prideful arrogance. Darlene confessed the devastating truth to her weeping daughter. Years ago, eager to associate herself with Marcus's fake corporate wealth, Darlene had proudly co-signed as a guarantor on one of his elite investment accounts. She thought it was a status symbol to show off to her church friends. She never bothered to read the fine print. The Internal Revenue Service traced the embezzled funds directly to that specific account. Because Darlene was legally listed as a guarantor, she was held responsible for the financial penalties. The government seized Darlene's pension, her car, and her home to pay back the stolen money. The mother who stole my college fund to spoil her favorite daughter, and the golden child who spent her entire life stealing my joy, were now left sitting on the dirty curb. They had no money, no home, no reputation, and absolutely nowhere left to run. The heavy, crushing weight of their toxic choices had finally buried them both in the dust. The dust settled rapidly over the ruins of the Davenport family. The federal justice system moves notoriously slow for the wealthy, but when the wealth is proven to be a total mirage built on stolen funds, the gears of justice grind with terrifying efficiency. Weeks passed, turning into a brisk, unforgiving autumn. The trial of Marcus Davenport did not drag out into a glamorous courtroom drama. Faced with mountains of irrefutable digital evidence, offshore account ledgers, and the damning testimony of a highly paid escort who happily flipped on him for full immunity, Marcus and his high-priced defense attorneys completely abandoned ship. He was forced to accept a harsh reality. Standing before a federal judge in a bright orange jumpsuit stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant smirk, Marcus was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The man who had demanded $5 million in my foyer was now assigned a prison job scrubbing cafeteria floors for 13 cents an hour. Trent fared only slightly better, though his punishment was arguably more devastating to his massive, fragile ego. Realizing I possessed every single forged document and email chain proving his money laundering operation, the great white savior folded instantly. He took a coward's plea deal to avoid a longer trial. Trent was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The man who had constantly spewed racist microaggressions about street mentality was now locked in a concrete cell, completely stripped of the white privilege and corporate armor he had used to terrorize and belittle others his entire life. While the men rotted behind bars, the women who had enabled them were subjected to a far more agonizing punishment. They had to actually live in the real world. Beatrice Davenport, the self-proclaimed queen of the elite suburban socialites, found herself permanently exiled from the luxury she worshipped. With her house foreclosed, her assets seized, and her son incarcerated, Beatrice was forced to move into a cheap, low-income motel on the absolute worst side of Sacramento. The woman who used to sneer at my background now spent her days sitting on a stained mattress, listening to police sirens wailing outside her thin window, surrounded by the cheap plastic bags that held the pathetic remnants of her designer wardrobe. Darlene and Chloe experienced a similarly brutal descent into absolute poverty. Because Darlene had proudly co-signed on Marcus's fraudulent accounts, the Internal Revenue Service had legally stripped her of everything she owned. The golden child and her toxic mother were forced to rent a cramped, mold-infested one-bedroom apartment. With no education, no actual skills, and zero work ethic, Chloe was forced to take a minimum-wage job working the night shift at a fast food drive-thru just to keep the lights on. Darlene, the woman who had stolen my college fund to pay for European yacht parties, was now scrubbing floors at a local laundromat. Their social destruction in the African-American community was absolute and unrelenting. When Darlene and Chloe attempted to return to Greater Hope Fellowship to beg for financial assistance, the church elders literally shut the heavy oak doors in their faces. The congregation had seen the certified medical records. They had witnessed the pregnant escort. They knew Darlene had stolen from her own daughter to fund a massive fraudulent lie. The pastor, who had tried to publicly shame me just weeks prior, stood on the church steps and formally banned Darlene and Chloe from the premises. The women who used to sit in the front pews, judging everyone else, were now complete pariahs, ostracized and ignored by the very community they used to rule. The stark contrast between their pathetic, miserable existence and my rapidly ascending empire was staggering. As they scraped together pennies for bus fare, my legal team was busy finalizing the easiest, cleanest divorce settlement in the history of California family law. Because Marcus was a convicted federal felon who had attempted armed extortion and home invasion, the family court judge did not even entertain a discussion about asset division. I retained 100% of my wealth, my properties, and my corporate holdings. Furthermore, the judge granted me full, uncontested sole legal and physical custody of Zuri. Marcus was permanently stripped of all parental rights. He was legally erased from my daughter's life forever. I sat in my expansive glass-walled penthouse office overlooking the downtown skyline, feeling an incredible sense of supreme liberation. I was no longer the punching bag for a family of toxic narcissists. I was no longer hiding my immense wealth to protect a weak man's fragile masculinity. I was the senior managing director of a private equity firm that was currently reshaping the entire real estate and financial market of the city. I wore power suits tailored to perfection, commanded boardrooms full of seasoned executives, and returned home every single evening to a peaceful, fiercely protected sanctuary where my daughter could thrive. My assistant knocked softly on the heavy glass door of my office, breaking my concentration on the quarterly earning reports. She stepped inside carrying a small silver tray holding my morning mail. She placed the stack of sorted envelopes on my desk and quietly exited the room. I sifted through the sleek corporate envelopes until my fingers brushed against cheap wrinkled paper. I pulled out a standard flimsy white envelope. The return address was scrawled in handwriting I recognized instantly. It was from Darlene. The letters were shaky, desperate, and stained with what appeared to be dried tears. I did not need to open the envelope to know exactly what was written inside. It would be a pathetic, manipulative letter begging for my forgiveness. She would undoubtedly try to invoke the sacred bond of family. She would cry about how hard she and Chloe were struggling. She would apologize, not because she was genuinely remorseful for stealing my future and enabling my abusers, but because she was broke, hungry, and completely out of options. She wanted access to my bank accounts. She wanted the strong black woman she had abused for decades to swoop in and rescue her from the consequences of her own horrific choices. I held the wrinkled envelope between my manicured fingers. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical indifference. I did not slice the envelope open. I did not read a single word of her desperate apologies. I simply turned my expensive leather office chair to the side, positioned the sealed envelope directly over the open slot of my heavy-duty industrial paper shredder, and let it go. The machine roared to life, violently grinding her pathetic pleas into thousands of tiny, meaningless, and entirely unreadable shreds of paper. Exactly 1 month later, the harsh metallic grinding of that industrial paper shredder was officially replaced by the elegant chiming of crystal champagne glasses. The Sacramento Convention Center had been completely transformed into an ultra-exclusive fortress of absolute luxury. Valets rushed to open the doors of imported black town cars and sleek armored SUVs. The absolute highest tier of the city elite had gathered under the massive, glittering chandeliers. Mayors, federal judges, private equity titans, and the most influential power brokers in California were all in attendance. They were not there for a charity dinner. They were there to pay their utmost respect to the new, undisputed queen of the financial district. I stepped out of my vehicle and the flash of cameras instantly illuminated the warm August night. I wore a breathtaking floor-length emerald green gown tailored to absolute perfection. The rich silk fabric pooled around my gold stiletto heels as I walked up the grand staircase. Diamonds rested heavily against my collarbone, reflecting the flashing lights of the press. I did not walk with the hesitant, timid steps of a woman who had been betrayed. I walked with the absolute devastating confidence of a woman who had purchased the very ground her enemies used to walk on. When I entered the grand ballroom, the low murmur of high society conversations immediately ceased. Every single eye turned in my direction. The string quartet stopped playing, and a sudden thunderous wave of applause erupted across the massive room. I smiled, acknowledging the respect I had violently clawed out of the dirt. I glided through the sea of powerful executives, taking my rightful place at the absolute center of the head table. The master of ceremonies, a prominent federal judge, stepped up to the podium and spoke about resilience, power, and the restructuring of the local financial empire. When he finally announced my name, the crowd rose to their feet for a standing ovation. I walked up the velvet-lined steps and took my position behind the glass podium. I looked out over the hundreds of wealthy, influential faces. I thought about Beatrice rotting in her cheap motel. I thought about Trent pacing a concrete federal cell. I thought about my mother scrubbing floors at a local laundromat. They had tried to bury me in the dirt, but they completely forgot that I was a seed. Thank you all for being here tonight. I began, my voice echoing clearly through the massive ballroom speakers. We are gathered this evening to celebrate not just the acquisition of wealth, but the weaponization of justice. For far too long, the concept of family loyalty has been used as a heavy chain to keep powerful women shackled to toxic, destructive environments. We are told to absorb the abuse. We are told to shrink ourselves to protect the fragile egos of the men around us. We are told to suffer in absolute silence just to keep the peace at the dinner table. The crowd hung on my every single word. I gripped the edges of the glass podium. Tonight that generational curse is officially broken, I announced. It is my absolute honor to formally launch the Zuri Foundation. I am personally seeding this initiative with a fully funded $50 million endowment. Gasps of pure shock and awe rippled through the elite crowd. $50 million in pure liquid capital was an earth-shattering philanthropic move. This foundation is dedicated entirely to providing elite legal representation, financial restructuring, and advanced educational support for Black women and children who are actively escaping toxic family dynamics and severe financial abuse, I continued. We will provide the armor they need to tear down the people trying to destroy them. No woman will ever have to choose between her safety and her financial stability again. If they do not have a seat at the table, my foundation will buy them the entire building. The ballroom erupted. The applause was deafening, shaking the very walls of the convention center. I stood under the bright stage lights, soaking in the absolute triumph of my reality. I had turned a calculated, horrific betrayal into a multi-million-dollar empire of pure, ruthless justice. Hours later, the gala ended, and the last of the elite guests went home. I returned to my ultimate sanctuary. I walked into the quiet, expansive space of my glass-walled penthouse office, overlooking the glittering Sacramento skyline. The city lights sparkled like diamonds spread across a black velvet canvas. I walked over to the custom velvet playpen resting in the corner of my office. I reached down and gently lifted my beautiful 1-year-old daughter Zuri into my arms. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and rested her warm little head against my shoulder. I held her close, walking right up to the edge of the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows. I looked out over the vast, sprawling city that I now completely owned. There was absolutely no forced forgiveness in my heart. There was no toxic family reconciliation waiting in the wings. I would never sit across a dinner table and break bread with the people who had tried to leave my daughter homeless. I had completely severed the rotting branches of my family tree so that my daughter could finally bloom in the sunlight. The cycle of abuse was permanently shattered. Zuri would never know the pain of being a scapegoat. She would never have to shrink herself to make a mediocre man feel tall. She would grow up in a fortress of absolute security, knowing that her mother was a titan who burned an entire corrupt empire to the ground just to keep her safe. I wrapped my arms tighter around my beautiful daughter, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace. I leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead. The nightmare was over. The massive empire was completely secure. It was the absolute sweetest payoff I could have ever imagined.